At the Christmas dinner table, my grandfather slammed his hand down hard. Why is a complete stranger in control of the multi-million-dollar organic distribution empire I bought for my granddaughter? I, Olivia, froze, the fork with a piece of roast turkey halfway to my mouth. His words hit like a thunderclap, silencing the entire room in an instant. The table had been lively just seconds before laughter, clinking glasses, the smell of roasted turkey and expensive Cabernet filling the air of the historic Napa Valley mansion. My grandfather, George, had just returned from a long European business trip and was sitting at the head of the table. Then, out of nowhere, his palm crashed against the mahogany wood, making every crystal wine glass tremble. He stared straight across the table, his voice low but sharp as a pruning knife. Why is a stranger running the $6 million vineyard and logistics company I purchased and put in Olivia's name 4 years ago? I slowly lowered my fork, letting my eyes widen in what looked like total shock. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice shaky and confused. Grandpa, what are you talking about? I don't even have a single dollar in my own name. How could I possibly own a company? The silence that followed was suffocating. My dad's knuckles turned white around the carving knife. My mom's face drained of color. My older brother Kevin and his wife Chloe exchanged a quick, nervous glance. No one dared to speak. Grandpa leaned forward slightly. He explained calmly that a few weeks earlier, an old business associate had called him by mistake, thinking he was still involved. The associate congratulated him on the new owner, a man named David Carter, who was now fully in charge of the company's rare vintage sales. I kept the stunned expression on my face, asking softly, David Carter? I've never even heard that name before. Inside, everything was racing, but I stayed quiet, watching their reactions, waiting for what would come next. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Have you ever been the black sheep of a family that only values your silence? I'd love to know who's part of our community. My mother, Patricia, stepped forward immediately, her voice taking on that high, artificial sweetness that always meant she was lying. George, honey, you've just flown across 9 time zones. The long flight, the jet lag, it's only natural that your memory is getting a little fuzzy. She reached out to pat his arm, her smile too wide and eyes too bright. There is no David Carter, she whispered. My father, Jeffrey, nodded, his eyes never leaving the turkey as he carved another slice with clinical precision. It's Christmas, he said. A time for family and peace, not for audits and business disputes that don't exist. We should be celebrating that you're home safe. I sat there, frozen in the opulent glow of the dining room, letting the silence settle over me like a heavy blanket. I watched them gaslight an 80-year-old man with the same ease they used to lie to me for years. Inside, the shaking had stopped. My mind shifted from fear to calculation. I looked at the centerpiece of rare white roses and the crystal glasses that cost more than my entire year of rent. Then I thought about my basement apartment in Portland. For 3 years, I lived in a room that smelled like damp concrete and old intentions. The single window was at street level, meaning the only view I had of the world was the dirty shoes of people passing by. While my brother Kevin was posting photos from yacht trips and tech conferences funded by the estate, I was counting out pennies to see if I could afford a second packet of instant noodles for dinner. I realized then that this was the trap of normalized cruelty. It's a specific kind of psychological warfare where a family decides that your suffering is just part of the scenery. To Patricia and Jeffrey, my poverty wasn't a tragedy they needed to fix. It was a tool they needed to maintain. They had spent years convincing me that I was the one who was failing, the one who wasn't quite classy enough to handle the family's legacy. By normalizing my struggle, they could strip my assets in broad daylight and still expect me to thank them for the invitation to dinner. It was efficient, it was heartless, and it was exactly what I needed to see to stop feeling guilty about what I had already done. Grandpa George didn't flinch. He didn't let Patricia's hand stay on his arm. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He didn't yell. He simply slid it across the mahogany table until it bumped against my father's wine glass. My business partner mistakenly emailed me the latest tax filings, George said, his voice as cold as a Napa winter. David Carter is listed as the primary owner of the distribution empire. I put in Olivia's name. Jeffrey's hand, the one holding the carving knife, began to tremble. Kevin's face went a sickly shade of gray as he looked at the official stamps on the documents. I slowly looked up from my plate, my eyes wide and watery, playing the part of the broken granddaughter one last time. "Grandpa," I whispered, "if there's a company worth $6 million in my name, why have I been working 3 jobs just to keep my heat on?" The room didn't just go silent. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the building. Jeffrey tried to laugh it off, but the sound was thin and brittle, like old parchment. "Olivia, honey, it's a misunderstanding," he said. "Business is complex. You wouldn't understand the restructuring we had to do to keep the estate afloat while the markets were down." I didn't waste breath arguing. I didn't offer them the satisfaction of a tear. I reached into my bag, pulled out my laptop, and set it right on the mahogany table next to the folder of lies. I didn't need to raise my voice, because facts don't need volume to be lethal. "I understand more than you think, Dad," I said, my voice clinical and steady. "I know David Carter very well. In fact, I'm the one who hired him." The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Jeffrey's mouth hung open, frozen in a silent gasp. Patricia's eyes darted between the glowing screen and my face, her artificial composure cracking like cheap glass. "You hired him," she stammered. "But he is the owner of the distribution empire. He is an undercover private investigator specializing in forensic accounting," I explained, my fingers moving across the keyboard with cold precision. "I hired him 6 months ago when I realized that $3,924 of my own meager savings money I earned from 3 different temp jobs while you told me I was a failure was being used to pay the estate's property taxes. You were telling me the business was on the verge of bankruptcy, yet you were using my sweat and my rent money to keep your name on the gate." I flipped the screen toward Grandpa George. On it was a live log of what I called the shadow auction. "This is why David Carter is the primary owner on those tax filings, Grandpa. He's been tracking the illegal liquidation of this estate's assets for the last 4 years. Look at the data. While I was living in that basement, eating noodles and wrapping dollar store cookies in newspaper, Jeffrey was secretly selling off 20-year-old vintages. He was auctioning off the rare bottles you spent your life perfecting to pay off high-stakes gambling debts in Las Vegas." Kevin tried to lunge for the laptop, his face contorted with desperation, but George's glare pinned him to his chair like a specimen on a board. I watched them and realized why I had stayed quiet for so long. People always ask why the black sheep accepts the scraps for years. They think it's weakness or a lack of spirit, but they don't understand the survivor's invisible chain. When you are raised in an environment where your only value is your compliance, you learn that silence is a survival instinct. You stay quiet not because you agree, but because you are waiting for the moment when you have enough ammunition to ensure that when you finally speak, they can never talk over you again. I was a prisoner of hope, chained by the belief that if I just worked hard enough, they would finally see me. But I realized they saw me perfectly, they just saw me as a resource to be harvested. "You called the business struggling to justify leaving me with nothing," I continued, looking my father in the eye. "But you weren't the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. diagnosing the blight in the North Vineyard last spring. I did that in secret. I walked those rows while you were away on business, using the skills you said were worthless. I saved the harvest that paid for this very dinner. And I did it while you were forging my name on distribution contracts to steal $900,000 from my trust. This isn't just revenge, Jeffrey. This is a forensic audit. And the balance sheet for this family is officially overdrawn." Patricia stood up, her face a mask of rehearsed tragedy. "Olivia, stop this," she said, her voice trembling with a fake emotion that would have fooled me a year ago. "You're not well. We've been so worried about you, living in that damp basement, isolating yourself from the people who love you. It's clear that the stress has fractured your mind. You're having a breakdown, honey." Jeffrey didn't even look at me. His thumbs were flying across his screen, his face lit by the cold blue light of his phone. "I've already authorized a statement for the Vineyard's social media page," he said, his voice flat and clinical. We are notifying our investors and patrons that a disgruntled, unstable relative is attempting to sabotage the family peace. We've had to be strict with you, Olivia, to protect the brand from your erratic behavior. We have medical assessments from your teenage years that prove you aren't mentally fit to manage a checking account, let alone a $6 million empire. I didn't flinch. I watched them pour the final glass of gaslight, expecting me to drown in it. But my mind was a balance sheet they could no longer cook. They weren't shocked by their own cruelty. They were shocked that I'd stopped being the silent investor in their version of family. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now the account was closed. Jeffrey's post was supposed to be his power move, but in reality, it was the final evidence of his intent to defame the rightful owner of this estate. He wasn't defending the business. He was protecting his access to a bank account that didn't belong to him. Grandpa George stood up then, and the silence that followed was heavier than the Napa fog. He didn't look at the documents. He looked at Patricia. It was the silent regret of the person who had spent 20 years hoping the roots weren't as rotten as the fruit. George's voice was a low rumble of ice. I have been the watchman of this legacy for decades, he began. And my greatest regret is that I spent those years waiting for my daughter to find her heart while her child was being devoured by her greed. I watched you both. I watched Jeffrey liquidate the rare vintages I left for Olivia. I watched Patricia ignore her daughter's poverty while buying designer bags with stolen dividends. This was the hidden struggle of the watchman. George revealed that he had been documenting their every move, trapped between the desperate hope that his own daughter would change and the devastating reality that she was a predator in silk. He had waited for me to find my voice, believing that if he saved me too soon, I would never learn how to fight back. He had been the silent observer, counting the cost of his own hesitation. But the time for waiting was over. Jeffrey's social media post wasn't a defense. It was a confession of malice. George turned to the door. We aren't here for a Christmas dinner anymore, he said. We're here for a forensic audit. And I've already called the one person who has been managing your so-called restructuring from the inside. The stranger on those tax filings isn't a ghost, Jeffrey. He's the man who has been documenting the $900,000 you moved from Olivia's trust into your offshore gambling accounts, and he is standing in the foyer right now. The double doors to the dining room opened, and the man who had been the ghost in my father's nightmares stepped into the light. David Carter wasn't the shadowy corporate raider my parents had invented to scare Grandpa. He was a forensic accountant with 30 years of experience dismantling white-collar fraud, and tonight he looked like an executioner in a charcoal suit. He didn't say a word to Jeffrey or Patricia. He simply walked to the table and placed a single, laminated document on top of the roast turkey platter. This is the authorization form for a $900,000 withdrawal from the estate's operating trust, David said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. It is dated 3 months ago. It authorizes the transfer of funds to a shell company in the Cayman Islands registered under Jeffrey's name. And at the bottom, right next to the date, is Olivia's signature. Jeffrey let out a strangled noise, half laugh, half sob. See? He stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the paper. She signed it. She authorized it. She's trying to frame me. I leaned forward, looking at the signature. It was perfect, the loop of the O, the sharp cross of the teat. It was identical to the way I signed my name. But that was the problem. It was too identical. David pulled out a transparency sheet and laid it over the document. This is a digital overlay from an employment contract Olivia signed 5 years ago when she worked a summer harvest for the estate, he explained. When we superimpose them, they are a 100% match, down to the pixel. No human being signs their name exactly the same way twice, Jeffrey. You didn't just steal the money. You copy-pasted your daughter's identity to do it. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a guillotine blade hanging suspended in the air. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This wasn't a misunderstanding about business restructuring or a mental breakdown. This was felony fraud. This was identity theft. This was a prison sentence printed on legal-sized paper. I looked at the document, and for a moment, the room blurred. I saw the world without Grandpa George. I saw the timeline where he hadn't intervened. In that version of reality, Jeffrey's gaslighting works. He posts that social media statement, and the world believes him. He uses the stolen $900,000 to bury me in legal fees I can't afford. I end up homeless, my reputation destroyed, watching from a distance as my parents drink my inheritance dry and let the vineyard rot. In that world, I am just a crazy woman who couldn't handle the pressure, and they are the grieving parents who did their best. That alternate reality was so close I could smell the sulfur of it. That is what they intended for me. They weren't just going to take the money. They were going to erase my existence to cover their tracks. But that world died the moment David Carter opened the front door. Through the entryway, beyond the foyer, blue and red lights began to flash against the high windows, reflecting off the crystal chandelier like a disco ball of justice. The police weren't just a threat anymore. They were the cleanup crew. Jeffrey slumped into his chair, his face turning the color of spoiled Merlot. Patricia looked at the flashing lights, then at me, her eyes wide with the realization that her performance was finally over. I didn't feel sorry for them. I felt the cold, hard weight of the ledger finally balancing out. "You should have checked the metadata, Dad," I said softly. "Because unlike you, I pay attention to the details." 1 week later, Jeffrey and Patricia stood at the wrought iron gates of the vineyard. They didn't arrive in the silver Mercedes they used to drive to country club lunches, that had been impounded as evidence in the fraud investigation. They arrived in a yellow taxi that waited with the meter running, a humiliating symbol of how quickly their facade had collapsed. I walked down the long gravel driveway to meet them, but I didn't unlock the gate. I stood on my side, the side that belonged to me, and looked at them through the bars. They looked like strangers. Jeffrey's suit was wrinkled, stripped of the arrogance that used to make him seem tall. Patricia's face was blotchy, her eyes darting around as if searching for an audience to perform for. "Please, Olivia," Patricia begged, her hands gripping the cold iron. "We can fix this. The lawyers are talking about prison time, about seizing everything. If you just drop the charges, we can work out a payment plan. We can be a family again. Think about the reputation of the estate." I looked at them and felt a sudden, profound clarity. I realized I was witnessing the illusion of power of an empty wallet. For my entire life, I had been intimidated by them. I thought they were powerful, untouchable giants who determined my worth. But looking at them now, stripped of the money they had stolen from me, I saw the truth. Their power wasn't an internal trait. It was a costume they had rented with my inheritance. They had built their entire identity on having, rather than being. They weren't strong. They were just expensive. And the moment the cash flow stopped, the people they pretended to be evaporated, leaving behind 2 frightened con artists shivering in the Napa morning mist. They crumbled so fast because there was no foundation beneath them, only the hollow space where their integrity should have been. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single envelope. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a settlement offer. It was a formal notice of divestment, signed by Grandpa George that morning. I slid it through the bars of the gate. It fell into the dust at Jeffrey's feet. "This is the eviction notice," I said, my voice calm and final. "It states that you are legally removed from the estate's board of directors, the family trust, and the property grounds effective immediately. You aren't losing the estate because of a scandal, Dad. You are losing it because you don't own it. You never did." Jeffrey stared at the envelope, his face twisting into a snarl of impotent rage. "You ungrateful brat," he spat. "We gave you life. We built this family. You're destroying everything because you can't handle a little tough love." I didn't flinch. Instead of stepping back, I moved closer to the bars until I was inches from his face, forcing him to smell the success he tried to steal. "I didn't destroy this family. Jeffrey," I said, "I just stopped letting you use my body to keep the fire warm. I stopped letting you use my future to pay for your mistakes. And as for tough love, you don't know the meaning of the word, but you're about to learn what tough justice feels like." I turned my back on them. Patricia screamed my name, a high, desperate sound that might have broken my heart a week ago. But today, It just sounded like noise. I walked back up the driveway toward the house that was finally, truly mine. I didn't look back. I listened to the sound of the taxi driving away, taking the last of the toxicity with it. The silence they left behind wasn't empty. It was full of peace. The next morning, the fog over the valley lifted early, revealing rows of vines heavy with the promise of a new season. I sat on the terrace of the estate, my estate, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of violet and gold. The silence was profound. No more frantic calls from Patricia, no more demands for money from Jeffrey, just the sound of the wind moving through the leaves and the quiet hum of a business finally returning to health. I opened my laptop, but this time, it wasn't to check for fraud or defend myself. It was to transfer funds. I moved the recovered $900,000, every cent Jeffrey had stolen and been forced to repay by the court, into a new account. I typed in the name, the Eleanor Project. It wasn't a revenge fund. It was a seed fund. I had decided to launch a nursery and grant program for young female vintners who had been cast out, overlooked, or told they weren't classy enough for the industry. I wanted to build a place where talent mattered more than pedigree, where hard work was currency, and where no one ever had to eat instant noodles in a basement while building someone else's dream. This was the justice of the seed sower. True revenge isn't about burning the enemy's house down. It's about building a fortress they can never enter. It's about taking the resources they tried to hoard and using them to grow a forest that shades everyone but them. Jeffrey and Patricia wanted a legacy of exclusivity and greed. I was giving them a legacy of opportunity, just not for them. Grandpa George walked out onto the terrace, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He set one down in front of me and sat in the chair opposite. He looked tired but lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "The bank alerts are gone," I told him, closing my laptop. "I deleted the last link to Dad's account this morning." He nodded, looking out over the vines his mother Eleanor had planted 50 years ago. "It's a strange thing," he said softly, "to cut off your own child. You feel like you've failed nature. You didn't fail nature, Grandpa," I said. "You protected it. You pruned the dead wood so the rest of the vine could survive." We sat in silence for a while, letting the truth of that settle between us. I thought about the concept of letting go of bloodlines to find oneself. Society tells us that family is everything, that blood is a binding contract you can never break. But that's a lie designed to keep victims compliant. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for them, is to let go. By cutting them off, I forced them to face their own reality for the first time. I didn't destroy them. I just stopped saving them from themselves. And in doing so, I found the person I was always meant to be. Not the spare, not the resource, but the architect of my own life. I stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace. The air smelled of earth and grapes and freedom. I realized I was finally breathing without a weight on my chest. I had my grandfather, I had my work, and for the first time in 27 years, I had a future that was entirely my own. To everyone out there who has ever felt like the outsider in their own home, this is my letter to you. I know how cold it is at the edge of the family photo. I know the ache of trying to buy love with silence and service. But I want you to know that your value does not depreciate based on someone else's inability to see it. You are not a resource. You are not a backup plan. You are the main character of a story. They are too small to understand. Don't wait for them to give you a seat at the table. Build your own table, and don't be afraid to change the locks on the door. If you've ever had to cut a toxic tie to find your own worth, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories of justice served, and tell me in the comments, was Olivia's revenge too cold, or just right?